I'm Teresa Binken, CEO of National Speakers Bureau Canada and Global Speakers Agency. We envision that the sharing of ideas inspires action to make the world a better place. They're bringing you expert speakers and thought leaders for your conferences, training programs, and events, whether they be in person, online, or hybrid. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker of the day. Certainly in the lead up to the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which encourages attention all year long, we wanted to bring back one of our most popular webinar speakers, Jesse Wente. Jesse Wente is an Anishinaabe writer, broadcaster, speaker, and arts leader. You may know him best for his almost 25 years of commentary on current events on CBC's Metro Morning. His 11 years with the Toronto International Film Festival included his role as Director of Film Programs at the TIFF Bell Lightbox. He co-produced the award-winning screen adaptation of Thomas King's best-selling book, The Inconvenient Indian, and was named the first Executive Director of the Indigenous Screen Office. Today, he's Chair of the Canada Council for the Arts, the only First Nations person to ever hold that position. He's also the best-selling author of Unreconciled, the topic of today's presentation, and named one of Indigo's top 10 biographies. Welcome, Jesse. It's good to see you again.
Well, thank you so much, Teresa, for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And I'm just going to start. We're going to talk a lot about truth and reconciliation and why I titled my book Unreconciled. But first, just a little brief history about my family in terms of why or how I have come to this conversation. So my dad's side of the family comes from a small place you've probably heard of called Chicago. They came up in the mid 60s. His mom was getting remarried to his stepdad, and so she moved the family north when he was a teenager. And he was it was at Malvern High School in the beach area of Toronto that he met my mother, Connie. And my mom's family comes from a place called Ganabajing, which is on the north shore of Lake Huron. The government calls it the Serpent River First Nation. It's on the north shore of Lake Huron, about an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on how fast you drive on the highway, west of Sudbury. And I'm a member there at Serpent River First Nation. My mom ended up in Toronto because her mom, a woman named Norma Miyawasaki, she had moved to Toronto when she was about 17 years old, just after she got out of residential school. She had gone to residential school at St. Joseph's School for Girls, which was located in a place called Spanish, Ontario, about an hour down the highway, again, depending on how fast you drive, from Serpent River, also on Lake Huron. She attended St. Joseph's School for Girls for, again, 10 years, from the time she was 6 years old till the time she was 16. She was born in 1927 in Ganabajing. Her parents, my great-grandparents, Alex and Maggie Miyawasaki, had been the chief, and she was the midwife and medicine woman for the community. And so when she went into the school in St. Joseph's, she only would have spoken Anishinaabe-Moan, or our language, Ojibwe. When she came out, she really only spoke English. That was, the big result. And she also came out not feeling that comfortable with who she was and where she came from. So she moved to Toronto, where she met my mom's dad, Jack Feltham, who was just back from the war. He was about 20 years her senior, and they had a family in Toronto, and that's where I ended up in Toronto. So I'm what would be described, or could be described, as an intergenerational survivor of residential school. And we say that because residential schools, and if you don't know, they predate Canada. They were started in the early 1830s by the church, the Catholic Church. And then when Canada was formed, one of the first laws it passed in 1876, so 9 years after Canada came to be, through the British North America Act, it passed the Indian Act, which codified residential schools and meant that the government would pay the church to run the schools. So it's key to why we would say intergenerational survivor is because what's key to understand about the point of residential schools is they were meant to eliminate Indigenous people, culture, and language, remove them from their community and the land. And what's important was it was meant to do that not just to my grandmother, but it was equally as important that I don't speak the language either, and that my children don't speak the language, and that my grandmother's daughter, my mom, didn't speak the language. So that sort of separation is always meant to break up those families and lose that knowledge forever. It's never meant to come back. Please excuse the vacuum cleaner if you hear it in the background. So that's why we would describe myself as an intergenerational survivor. In terms of where we stand, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which released its final report now 7 years ago in 2015. They had heard testimony from over 6,000. They interviewed over 6,000 people, many of them survivors, many of them who told their stories for the first time. My grandmother, Norma, she rarely ever spoke. She really only ever spoke to me specifically about it once, when I asked as a 10-year-old why we didn't speak Ojibwe in the house. And she told me because she went to the school. And she also told me that when she would speak it in the school, the teachers would have you stick out your tongue and they would hit your tongue with a ruler to dissuade you from speaking the language. So we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you probably all know, there was 94 recommendations or calls to action. I think if you're generous, about 12 of those have been completed, including, by the way, one of them was the designation of a day of remembrance, September 30th. So that gives you an idea of that's a fairly easy one to accomplish. So there's still a lot left to be done. And obviously, given the title of my book, Unreconciled, I worry that we're not really thinking of this or positioning it in the way we need to. So let's just talk about this. So I'm going to talk about it in 3 stages: truth and reconciliation, and you'll understand why it's in a little bit. So truth. So let's talk about truth for a second. So there's 2 stages to truth. Okay, there's 2 elements to how truth is told. The first part is the telling of the truth. And that was what the TRC was. And I would say that was what the Royal Commission, which was a predecessor to the TRC, released in 1996, which says many of the same things. So a full generation earlier, we already knew these sorts of issues. So the truth being told. And when the survivors testified, when we write books, when in our art, Indigenous people, I would say, have been telling their truth for quite a while at this point. The second stage, or the second part of truth, is maybe where we run into the challenge, which is there's the telling of the truth. The second part is the acceptance of the truth. And I think that's where we have hit a bit of a snag in Canada. Because of course, the importance of that is that we can tell all the truth in the world. Okay, I can tell you that the sky is blue, which is true. But if you don't accept that, and if you don't agree, it becomes virtually impossible to actually move to any next stage, because all we're left is arguing of what is true and what is not. And it's key to understand with residential schools that the truth of them was always obscured. Always, always. You have to remember, they were positioned and sold to folks that they were necessary, that Indigenous people were backwards, primitive, that we had to learn all of these things. So we had to send them to these schools. Also baked into residential schools, the process of them was denialism. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that these schools were actually not built. And I think eventually we'll stop calling them schools, because they weren't actually there to teach the kids much of anything. What they were there for was to deny them things. deny them their language, deny them their culture, deny them their family, deny them their community, deny all of these things. So denialism is actually baked right into the very concept of why we even had residential schools to begin with. And now we've seen a resurgence of denialism. And you have to understand that the TRC, the reason we even had the TRC was because of a lawsuit from survivors that they won in court. That part of the settlement, part of the victory was that the government had to do a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So one of the hard truths I'm going to quickly share is that no government in Canada wanted to do this. None of them would have done it if they hadn't been a court decision. And every government in the history of this country is complicit in the denial and the obscuring of this truth from Canadians. Every single one. It does not matter what political party. They've all hidden these truths away from you. They've burned records. To this day, they keep the records away from the survivors and their families. So, so key is when we're in this stage of trying to accept the truth is that when we see denialism and that we make sure to spot it. And denialism when it comes to residential schools takes very sophisticated forms these days. It usually does not actually deny that the schools existed because it's a little hard. Like you can go visit the school my grandmother went to, like it's there, it's still standing. So can't deny that they didn't exist. So usually what you see is denial that they were that bad, that nowadays that there weren't graves. There was a grave site built on the school my grandmother went to. We know there were, I believe the number is 48 children that were buried there. When the school was closed in the mid-60s and they destroyed all the records, they also took down all the tombstones. So it's now what would be called an unmarked grave, even though at one point it was a marked grave. And in fact, when an Indian agent visited the school in 1920, so 6 years before my grandmother attended, sorry, 6 years before she was born, they actually sent a letter to the government asking why there were so many headstones in the grave. So again, the government knew kids were dying at these schools, being buried in graveyards there, and they also knew that the gravestones were removed. So now we have people denying that happened, but we actually know it did. So keep an eye out for those things, and Canadians need to accept this. And I know it's hard because these are very hard truths, but it is important that we accept it so we can get to the next phase. And the next phase, surprisingly, is not actually reconciliation. That's part 3. There's a middle part where "and" exists in the phrase. And I want to make sure I say something very key here, which is be very suspicious whenever you hear the word reconciliation without truth attached to it. Because that is, I think, a purposeful tactic, because without truth, how do we know what we're reconciling in this, right? We need to hold on to that truth. If we lose the truth, reconciliation can become anything, and that's not what it is. The government can decide it's doing this and doing that, but that's not actually reconciliation. So we have to always have truth and reconciliation. And another quick truth I'll share with you is that truth and reconciliation is not for Indigenous people. It's just not. What new truths do Indigenous people have to reconcile about residential school? We don't. We know all of these truths. It cooked me breakfast in the morning when I was a kid. So I don't need to reconcile. It's for non-Indigenous people who are hearing these truths for the first time that they have to reconcile, that this is what happened in their name on these lands. So before we can get to the reconciliation, that part, that "and" part, is a part that we don't talk about enough in Canada, but we need to start to. And it's a good word for it would be reparations. I'll give you a quick story about why this is so important. When I was 10 years old, I got a brand new BMX bike. This was 1984. So you can imagine getting a brand new BMX bike when you're 10 years old in 1984 is just about the coolest thing that could possibly happen to you. So I went to take my new BMX bike out for a ride, the very first ride that I would take it around the neighborhood. And I ran into another local neighborhood kid who proceeded to punch me out and take my bike. So I went home and I told my dad that this kid had taken my bike. And my dad took me and we went over to this other kid's house. knocked on the door, and the parent came forward. Now, here's where I'd have to ask you, what do you think happened next? Do you think, in this instance, that my dad said to this parent, if you just say you're sorry, we're good and we'll go away? Or do you think my dad said, return the bike, then say you're sorry, then we'll be okay? And of course, the answer is the second one. The bike has to be returned before we can get to an apology, before we can get beyond an apology and into a new relationship. So when we talk about reparations, the and part in truth and reconciliation, what we mean is that the bike has to be returned to Indigenous people. All of the things taken from us, language, culture, our communities, and yes, even the land, actually has to come back to us in order for us to get to the reconciliation part. Otherwise, I'm accepting an apology without the bike. And I don't see why anyone would ever do that. So we need to, and what I tell the government these days, including, well, whatever, the top people in the government is how I'll put it, let's say it that way, is that I think what we actually need to see is we need to see this government, all governments in all of these colonial states, what we need to see them is invest in the return of what was taken with the same abundance, vigor, and precision that they invested in taking these things away. And let me tell you, these governments invested billions, if not trillions, into taking these things away from Indigenous people. There are people who got raises, who have passed down cottages to their kids because they were very good at taking things away from Indigenous people. We need to reverse that and have a whole industry that gives these things back to Indigenous people, our languages, our cultures, everything. So that's what we need to see. We need to lower and eliminate all the fake barriers of colonialism, right? All the stuff that was imposed on us that has kept us out of full participation, even in this country, right? Indigenous people didn't have the vote until 1960. We weren't allowed to have a lawyer until the 50s. We weren't allowed to gather in groups of 7 until the 50s. You can tell why we might be poor now, because we were locked out of the very system that everyone else had access to. So once we have reparations, then we can start talking about reconciliation. Now, obviously, I'm not convinced reconciliation is actually what we want. That suggests we're repairing a once functioning relationship. I'm not sure we've ever had, Canada, the state, has ever had a functioning relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. I think what we really need, and this is not to denigrate the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I know those folks. I'm dear friends with them. It's incredibly valuable what the work that they did. But I think the way it's been interpreted can be a challenge. So what does reconciliation actually mean, do I think? What do we mean? I think what we mean is the building and living of right relations. Now, what do we mean by right relations? Well, this is a phrase and a concept that comes up a lot for Anishinaabe and many Indigenous nations, right relations, because we believe that we should live in right relations with literally everything in the world. The plants, the trees, the bird, everything we have to live in right relationship with, because we view everything as a relationship. So there are 4 R's of right relationships: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. I'll say them again: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. So even think of the personal relationships you have. If they're not respectful, do you keep them? If they're not relevant to you, do you keep it? If they're not reciprocal, in other words, if you're the one always giving and the other person is always taking, do you keep that relationship? And again, maybe it's important that I say relationships that aren't family, because listen, we all got family, right? So we can't do that. And then the 4th one, responsibility. Are you responsible for each other, to each other in this relationship? Now, again, apply those 4 R's to the perceived relationship that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are supposed to have with Canada. Can you see at any point when those 4 R's were actually met in our relationship with the state? Because I can't. I cannot see where our relationship has ever been based in respect, has ever been relevant for us, has ever been reciprocal, and has never been particularly responsible. And that's actually what we have to get to in order to reconcile. And this will require frankly, a rethinking, a reconstitution of what it means ultimately for it to be Canada. But I think we have to get there. In fact, I think that it is the thing that Canada can do that would set it apart from any other nation on the planet, is if it can actually figure out how to live in right relations with the nations that have been here, like the Anishinaabe Nation has been here for 13,000 years. We aren't going anywhere. We are still here. We will still be here after Canada. It's actually Canada's choice whether it gets to persist on these lands, and its only pathway is by living in right relations with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people that have lived here since, well, as my grandmother would say, forever, which, given 13,000 years, I think is a fine way to interpret forever. So when we're thinking about how we do this, that's really those four aspects of relationship. You want to build those into whatever you're doing with First Nations people. You want to build, we are not equity seeking, we are sovereignty seeking people. So outcomes for us exist beyond the scopes of any DEI framework that you may have at your company, because sovereignty looks different than equity, and sovereignty is what we seek, continue to seek. And frankly, it is only through our sovereignty that Canada can secure its own. That has always been true, and it didn't do it when it formed. So it will have to do it at some point in the future. So I want to stop there and leave time for questions, and welcome Teresa back. So thank you so much for listening. And I'll say in my language, miigwech, 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 chi miigwech, we say it 4 times for all 4 directions. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jesse. And I'm seeing those coming back to you in the chat. Really appreciate both your personal and your professional experience sharing to help our audience understand a bit better, and the 4 Rs memorable and a great framework to work with. I will share some of the questions that we've got coming up here. There is one off the top from Dana asking about the September 30th date. Do you know, is there significance to that date in terms of it being chosen as the Day of Remembrance?
It was Orange Shirt Day. An Orange Shirt Day was a day that came up, and her name just flew out of my head. That was meant to honor a woman who attended residential school on the West Coast. It's a famous story now. She wore her favorite orange shirt. Phyllis Webstad, thank you, Shay, for that. Phyllis went to residential school. She wore her favorite orange sweater to school, but like they would have with my grandmother, they took all your clothes when you got to the school. So they took her orange sweater away, and she never got it back. And so that's why we honor Phyllis with Orange Shirt Day, which was September 30th. So I think for the government, it just made sense for them to anoint that as the day off. The one thing about Phyllis's story that I always think is important to share is that this year, I think Phyllis turned 56. So this is not ancient history, right? Like, yeah, my grandmother went to one in the 30s, but Phyllis is just a little bit older than I am, and she still attended residential school. The last one closed in Canada in 1996. So this is not some long ago period. If I had been born north of Toronto, I would have gone to residential school in the 70s and the 80s. So it's not long ago. But I think that's why the September 30th, because it had been Orange Shirt Day for a few years before then.
Thank you. We have another question asking about, for organizations looking to bring awareness to this topic and human rights in general, any suggestions on how best to approach without offending?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always important to rely on people with lived experience for these sorts of things. So, it's one of the challenges, like it's key to understand that, like, the Canadian state didn't really want non-Indigenous Canadians to ever meet Indigenous Canadians. That's why there's no urban reserves, right? Because it's not because their Indigenous people weren't here. Indigenous people have been in Toronto again for thousands of years. That's why the settlers settled here. That's why all settlers settled in all the Canadian cities we see along the southern, is because there were already Indigenous people there. But when the reserve system came in, they moved us out because they just didn't want you to ever know us. And the assumption was that through their policies, by this time, you wouldn't know us because we'd be gone. That was the goal. So this creates a real problem now when people want to learn about Indigenous people, and we've been excluded from curriculum and education and all of this stuff for so long. So you won't necessarily find textbooks. You are starting to find them, but you won't necessarily find stuff. So I think people, rely on people as much as you can, bring those people in to speak with them. And then when they, again, to go back to what I said earlier, when they speak their truth, accept it, because we're telling you what we lived through. And it's important that you understand that we're not, these aren't easy things to share, and we don't do it to gaslight or do anything. It's just try to share to bring awareness to these things. So to me, that's still probably the best way, is to actually physically, whether it's on Zoom or physically, is to bring in people. And then I would say books, TV shows, movies, like there is a lot of that stuff that, especially now in the last 10 years, so many marginalized communities have started to break through on those in the media. So there is plenty of that to also read. A quick book that I always recommend is Bob Joseph's books, 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act. I think that's a very important book for all Canadians to read, because, by the way, you also live under the Indian Act. Like, it's a law that governs your relationship with our communities. So it's written in very plain English, very simple to understand. And I think it's a great book for Canadians to understand a law that most Canadians, they don't even tell you that it exists. It's something you have to sort of figure out later. So that would be, rely on lived experience, at least now, as we build up our capacity to have that knowledge passed on.
Thank you. Marie-Hélène has a question about what do you think Canada should and could do in terms of giving back the land? Can you please explain what treaty negotiations are in this context?
Oh, well, I mean, we're not having a ton of treaty negotiations around, although we have seen the government give some land back. I mean, I think the first and quickest thing to do, and it's interesting we have this quick conversation on this week, is the first thing they should do is give up everything called Crown land, which, by the way, is the majority of the country. Sits in what they call Crown land. Crown land is stolen land. That's all it is. It's not real. Crown land is not a thing that exists. It's just land that the Crown declared was theirs, and it's just not. Particularly in places out west where there aren't even treaties covering that it was Crown land. It's just, most of British Columbia, there's no treaty. Like, it's just seized. It's not Canada, would be my, I guess, how I would put it to you. It's not really Canada over there. Likewise, Manitoulin Island, which is very close to my community, that's unceded. That's also not really Canada, to be honest. It's Anishinaabe territory. So I think that would be the first thing to do, is all Crown land, immediately dissolve Crown land, get rid of it, and give that right back to us as something. And then I think you have to look at, because again, I think it's important to understand that returning land does not mean people have to leave their houses or anything. It just means that Canada, its entire wealth is built off the land. And that is why our nations are poor, because we weren't allowed, we were removed from the land and then not allowed to use it in this way every other Canadian and the state used it to get rich. So we need access that back. I'll give you a quick example. If you've ever been to Penticton, BC, that town leases its land from the First Nation there. So the town does not own the land. They lease the entire town from the nation. As a result, that nation is incredibly wealthy. And I think that's actually sort of the correct model for how this should have been the whole time, which is, if Canada wants to exist, well then, because again, the treaty my nation signed, the Huron-Robinson Treaty of 1850, which predates Canada by 17 years, says in there that we should have received a share of all profits made from the land of the treaty, which, by the way, is a huge, vast territory of central and northern Ontario. And yet my annuity to this day from that treaty is $4 a year. That's it. So like my entire lifetime, that's what, 180 bucks, 190 bucks, something like that. From all the wealth generated in Ontario in the last 50 years, come on, that's not a real thing. So, and by the way, that's in front of the Ontario Superior Court now, because they've lost all the way up in the interpretation of the treaty. And it will likely mean, by the way, when it's decided, because they're going to lose again, because the treaty is quite clear. It will mean that the nations under Huron-Robinson will be owed billions of dollars will have to be paid back. So I think we need to look at those arrangements. But if I had to pick one, Crown land, return it immediately. Hey, it's a convenient moment. There's a shift in the old Crown anyway. I think it's a good moment to even, for Canadians, other non-First Nations folks, to actually have a discussion of why we're even a constitutional monarchy in 2022 in the first place. But also that, like my lot, it's complicated because, again, our treaty is with the Crown. It doesn't, nowhere in our treaty, you can go read it, it's on the internet, Huron-Robinson Treaty, nowhere in there is Canada mentioned, right? That Canada would ever rule us. Like, that's not a thing that we agreed to, because we couldn't have at the time. Canada didn't exist. So we might, with the Crown shakeup, Canada can divorce itself, but we might say, well, yeah, but that's what we agreed to. So this whole Canada might have to come back to the table for our folks again. But anyway, that's where I'd start. Let's start with the Crown land. That's an easy one to do.
Thank you, Jesse. And you've certainly generated a lot of discussion and thought and questions. We do still have a couple more, but I'm conscious of everyone's time and your time. I'm going to do the book draw and wrap it up. I do think you've addressed some of the questions that were still sort of outstanding. And if you're open to it, we could share those with you post-event and share some of that insight in the follow-up email that we do. If that sounds Absolutely. Good. Thank you again, Jesse, for again, your personal sharing and just building so much more awareness and knowledge for all of us and giving us some guidelines in terms of going forward. I can see all the notes coming through. Miigwech, thank you, Jesse. Thank you for a great presentation. I learned a lot. And thanks to everyone who joined us. We will be back again in 2 weeks' time with our next speaker. Take good care this month. Thanks, Jesse. Thanks all.
Thanks.